Welcome to Muswell Hill Baptist Church.
Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of children and infants, you have ordained praise because of your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all the flocks and birds and the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
So Ephraim's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was legally made over to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterwards, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were legally made over to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" "Make sure that you do not take my son back there," Abraham said. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter.
Today we come to the end of Abraham's life. And in three stories here, the story of the buying of a field for the burial place for Sarah and the rest of the family when the time came, and in the story of the bride finding a bride for his son Isaac, and in the story of the travel ban, that he would not let Isaac go and find and stay with the bride. Abraham shows his faithfulness to the promises of God right to the end of his life. First of all, in chapter 23, we read the story of the purchase of a field. Abraham bought this field as the only property that he had in the promised land. Now, you may know that Abraham has come a long way to come to the promised land, originally from Ur of the Chaldees, and then spending some time where his family still is in the story in Haran, which would perhaps be Syria today. And now he is in what we would call by various names, was then called Canaan. Today we would perhaps use the word the Holy Land. Well, he is a very wealthy king, but living kind of nomadically. He has no property. He is living on the land of others. And then comes the end of his life, and this is where Abraham buys a bit of land in the land that God has led him to. He pays a very high price for the land, 400 shekels of silver. And when we compare this to the purchasing of fields in other parts of the Bible, many hundreds or thousands of years later, this appears almost like tenfold what people usually paid. Abraham, however, was very, very rich. And so he could afford to pay 400 shekels of silver. But what is most significant was that he was willing to do it in order to get the cave to bury his wife and his future generations, including himself, and he had to buy the field and the trees with it. From the Bible's point of view, the significance of this story is huge. It is just that. Now, in this land that God has promised, but where Abraham owns nothing except all of the sheep and the people in their tents that travel around with him, he has now purchased a bit of land. Today it would be near the city of Hebron. The land was legally made over to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. So this is the way in which Abraham's life ends. It ends with him investing in the promised land, the land that God had said he would give to him. It raises questions for us about how we invest in our lives. It's relatively easy to invest in the education of our children because we hope to live to see the day when the education pays off. It's much harder to think of our great-great-grandchildren, who we may never, well, we will almost certainly never see. And as we imagine off into that unknown future, to invest in that is an act of great faith. But as Christians, we're called to that in every respect. In a church, perhaps the greatest days of our church are ahead of us, and we are, as it were, holding the baton in a race to hand over to someone who is going to get the glory at another finishing line. And, of course, in our own lives, Jesus instructed us to lay up for ourselves treasure in heaven. Jesus said to his followers, "This is a much better investment. The rust won't make it rusty. The moths won't eat it up." But we could say we can't see it. We don't know that that treasure is there. It's much better to have treasure here on earth where we can enjoy it and where we can count it. It's an act of faith to invest our treasure in heaven. This is what Abraham does. He buys the field in a land where he owns nothing else. When we get to chapter 24, we see this reinforced in a beautiful story. The story of how Abraham sent his senior servant to go and find a wife for his son Isaac. Here we come to the bride and the travel ban. Now, this is the thing. He does not want the bride to come from Canaan, where he is living. But he does not want Isaac to leave Canaan, where he is living. So the dilemma is how to get a wife who isn't from Canaan when the son has to stay in Canaan. And we need to think why these two things were important for Abraham. The reason why it was important to get the bride from outside Canaan was because of the nature of Canaan. It was, typically for its age, full of kings. We've seen a story about them way back in chapter 14. We'll put a link to that video at the end of this one. And in the chapters there, we saw 4 kings fighting 5 kings. So there were lots of these local, if you like, tribal leaders, of which in a way Abraham is now one. But of course, some of these kings owned the land, and Abraham doesn't. He doesn't want Isaac to marry into those kings' families, because undoubtedly, as an influential and wealthy king in his own right, Abraham would have been able to get one of the very beautiful daughters of one of the reasonably important kings. Abraham knew before the Bible was written that therein lies a trap. Much later on, we come to King Solomon. This is what we read in 1 Kings chapter 11. It happened at the time of Solomon's old age that his wives guided his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully with Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the god of the Sidonians, and after Molech, the abhorrence of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and did not fully follow after Yahweh as David his father. Solomon was a very blessed king in so very many ways at a much later stage of Israel's history. But you can see there that in his old age, he was wooed away by some of his very many wives. And long before that, Abraham had seen that if Isaac married into a family where idols were worshipped, where there was a cult of religion in which that whole tribe, if you like, was immersed, they were more likely to pull Isaac down than him pull them up. So he must get his wife back from his people, who we might remember have left Ur of the Chaldees at the behest of God. They are believers in the one true God. So that's where, as the story unfolds, Rebekah comes from. So to go and find this wife, he sets his senior servant the task. And we read about that in chapter 24. He said to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." As he is given this task of finding a woman who will not lead Isaac astray, though if you know the Bible, you'll know that Rebecca had her issues, the servant has a natural question, which any well-organised servant would have. Remember that this is a servant who is effectively the chief executive of several hundreds of people and many thousands of sheep and so forth. So he knows what he's doing. And so he has a question. And the question is, what if she won't come back? Verse 5. The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" Verse 6, "Make sure that you do not take my son back there." And Abraham goes on, "The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." This is a real travel ban. And this very elderly Abraham is very clear that his son must stay in Canaan. Of course, this is a reinforcement of buying the field. Abraham is very clear that God's promise will come true. He isn't going to live to see that much of it, but he believes the promise right through to the end. And because of that, his son must be in the land of promise. For Abraham, he wants the legacy of the promise of God to be passed down. He saw what we benefit from, which is that if God's promises to him are to be true, he must live in the promises to the very end of his life. If he is to have the offspring that God has promised, and if he is to have the land that God has promised, then obedience and trusting in the promise is the key. Or in another word, faith. Remember, it was in that land, at Bethlehem, that the King of Kings was born. And so the preparation is in this story. A man who long before the events we celebrate at Christmas and that we celebrate at Easter took place in the Holy Land, somebody believed that God had his hand on that land for the sake of the whole of the people of God. Faith is a test, it is a challenge, but it is a life. Sarah is dead. The issue of the miracle child is over. But Abraham will not let go of the promises. He's lived to over 100 years old. He owned no property in the land until these moments, but he believed the promises. And you may be young, or you may be old, but the challenge of what we've read today is to keep the faith. The first challenge is to get the faith, but the second challenge is to keep the faith, so that in our last moments we believe at least as much and hopefully a great deal more than we believed in the first moments. And down that route lies life and hope and the promises fulfilled.